Hi, my name is Nguyen. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy at University of Utah, and I'm here to tell you today about my current research project, which I hope you'll find interesting and relevant, which is about gamification and value capture. So, I basically have a worry that there are these trends in our world towards gamification, towards metrification, towards measures and metrics at an institutional level that are actually decreasing the diversity of our intellectual approaches, of our intellectual values, and of the richness of our life of thinking and understanding things. So I want to think about a phenomenon. Um, this is my term. It's kind of something that's floated through a lot of different academic texts that I'm a philosopher are trying to push together. And the idea is called value capture. So, value capture for me is what happens when one, an agent's values are rich and subtle, and then two, that agent enters a social atmosphere that presents a simplified, typically quantified version of these values, and then these simplified values start to dominate the agent's practical reasoning. So, here's examples of value capture: GPA, citation rates, retweet numbers, Facebook likes, numerical wine scoring, Fitbit numbers, quantified policing, and even money. So some examples, like you start exercising for your health, but you end up trying to max out your Fitbit per week numbers. Or you start trying to control your diet for health, but you end up trying to hit optimum targets for weight or BMI. Or, a story from my life, you go into philosophy graduate school with this love of truth and wisdom, and you leave caring about citation rates and the status of your publication on some kind of ranked journal list. Or you start tweeting for the sake of truth and justice and conversation, and then you end up captured by Twitter's metrics and aiming at producing viral popular content. So here's the basic thing that I'm worried about. It's that you might have these subtle, rich values, but once someone presents you with a simple quantified representation of a value, especially one that's shared across a company, across an institution, across a community, that clarity trumps your subtler values. The clarity takes over, even if it's not what you really wanted. So, to understand this, a lot of this research for me came out of thinking about games and the difference between playing actual games and gamifying the work and the environment. So, to explain this, what I really want to do is talk about two things. First, I want to give you a quick view of why I think games are awesome. And then I want to give you a discussion about why gamification of education, of research, of exercise can be really problematic. So let's start with games. So a lot of this discussion comes from this book. This is my book, Games Agency as Art, and most of the book is like a love song to games, and the last part is the beginnings of turning to worry about gamification and value capture. So just really quickly, here's my basic view about games. I think there are two basic motivations that you can take towards playing a game: achievement play and striving play. So, achievement play is playing for the sake of winning, for the value of winning, and striving play is temporarily pretending that you want to win for the value of the struggle, right? So, striving play, when you engage in striving play, you take on what I want to call a motivational inversion. That is, in normal life, you take the means to this for the sake of the end, but in game life, you pick up an end, you pick up a goal for the sake of the means it forces you through, right? Like I'm a rock climber, and I try to get to the top of the cliff not because it's valuable to be up there, but because struggle to try to get up there puts me through this really interesting, rich set of movements and decisions and problem solvings. So, one thing we basically learn is that our relationship to games is really interesting. We have what I want to call agential fluidity. That is, you can just open up a board game, open up a computer game, and that game can tell you what to care about, and you just do it, right? The game just tells you, okay, you're trying to kill other people, or okay, you're trying to collect the most gold, or okay, you're trying to cooperate with everyone else to end this pandemic, right? That's not hopefully not just a bad joke. That there's actually an incredibly popular cooperative board game called Pandemic right now that people love. Anyway, so what games highlight is we have this ability to be incredibly fluid about what we care about, an explicit system that just specifies points. We have this ability just to glom onto it and care about whatever it tells us to. And in games, I think this is really healthy because we're just doing it temporarily. We're trying out an alternate system and we step back from it, right? It's just temporary and it occurs in a secluded environment. But in gamifications, I want to worry about situations like with GPA or with citation rates, in which something presents you with a system of points that like drags on your values and cares and tries to get you to care about it, but you can't step back from it because it's pervasive, because it surrounds you. So, one last thing we should ask is why we play games, why they're so thrilling. There are lots of reasons, but there's one I want to highlight here. One of the reasons we play games is that in games we momentarily get to simplify what we value. So, ordinary life, our values are complicated and nauseating, right? There's a billion things we care about. They're hard to measure, they're hard to weigh off against each other. It's hard to really fully connect and explain what we care about in terms of what other people care about. But in a game, you get relief from that. In a game, you get what I want to call value clarity, right? So for a moment in a game, unlike the rest of life, you know exactly what you're doing, you know exactly how to get points, you know exactly how well you're doing, and you know exactly what other people are pursuing. So games, I think, are this kind of like momentary existential balm against the overwhelming confusion and value clarity of life. And that makes me think there's a particular danger of games. So, my biggest worry about games is that people who play a lot of games might export an expectation of value clarity from the game to the outside game space, right? And they might be drawn to systems and institutions and professions that offer them a game like feeling of total value clarity, where everything they're doing is perfectly scored and perfectly coherent. So, in a slogan, I'm not worried about games making serial killers, I'm worried about them making Wall Street bankers. So that's games. Now let's talk about gamification. So gamification is a process that builds game-like features like scoring systems and levels and achievements into ordinary activities like Fitbit and Strava and Twitter and Duolingo and Disney's gamified workforce. So famously, a lot of gamification advocates say that gamification makes you more motivated by making dull activities fun, by making them more like a game. What I want to point out is that a lot of the pleasure of games comes from having an extremely simplified value system that's been made artificially clear so it can be mechanically and easily measured. That creates value clarity. So, to get that pleasure in ordinary life, you need to simplify and narrow the goals of ordinary life. So, here's an example. I'm going to come back to this. But Twitter, which I think has become one of the central platforms for communication in our world, has a gamification. You can get really excited by Twitter. Twitter is super addictive. I feel the addictiveness of Twitter all the time. And it works when you get excited about the points. And notice that there are all kinds of reasons you might want to talk to people: connection, collaboration, communication, understanding, empathy. But Twitter's scoring system only aims at you at one thing, which is popularity, right? It aims you at the number of people that have liked or retweeted your tweet. And popularity is much easier to measure mechanically, but it's much less rich than this big plurality of other communicative values. So I'm really worried that Twitter is a case where a communication is being shoveled through this one singular value system that's getting everyone to value the same thing. And the thing they're valuing is there in large part because it's mechanically measurable. And insofar as all these different people with different values have hopped onto Twitter and gotten motivated by these points, then they're decreasing the plurality of values that they're communicating and talking for. Instead of all these different rich values, there's one, which is popularity. So um, so let's go back to value capture. So again, value capture is a case in which your values are rich and subtle, and you get put in a place that presents simplified, typically quantified versions of these values, and those simplified versions take over. So I want to point out that gamification is one kind of value capture. That is intentional gamifications, where Trump is trying to build a system to excite you. But I think there are a lot of other things that aren't intentional gamifications, but also work this way. Some system where someone's made some metric to measure people, often for totally sensible bureaucratic reasons, and that starts to take over people's motivations. So there's this incredible book from Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter, who work in the sociology of quantification, about what happens when the U.S. and News World and World Report starts issuing law school rankings. And one of the things they say is that before the law school rankings, there's this vast plurality of educational goals that different law schools had. But when the rankings came out, they only measured one particular thing, and anyone that didn't succeed in that thing was punished. So schools had to abandon various missions of serving the community, serving underserved members, serving social justice missions, and just aim at the US News and World Report's professed ranking system. Their most interesting finding for me was this. Before the US News and World Report, prospective law students would try to figure out what they wanted from an education. And to do that, they would have to think about what different schools said their educational mission was and compare it with what the student themselves valued and wanted out of an education. And this made students deliberate about what their values were in a legal education and a legal career. What Esplin and Sauter say is when the US News and World Report comes about and issues their law school rankings, students stop this entire process. They take their goal to be to get into the best school, and this US News and World Report just sets what the best school is. So to put this in philosophers' terms, what I'm suggesting is this is a case of value capture, and value capture just disrupts the process of value self-determination. So I think we should be choosing our values for ourselves and tailoring them to fit our psychologies and our place in the world. But value capture cuts off that process and substitutes a prefabricated and standardized value for a tailored one. So in a slogan, with value capture, an agent outsources the process of self-determination. And I just want to point, in a lot of cases, you're outsourcing your values to either the US News and World Report or like Facebook or, Apple, right? And that should be a little bit worrisome to you. Um, so here's a case study. One interesting case study for me is Twitter. So here's my claim. Twitter flattens the reasons we have for communication. So one thing you might say is, okay, wait, no, aren't Twitter scores just a proxy for good communication? That is, if everyone is liking whatever they value through good communication, for good communication, then shouldn't those scores just represent the plurality of everyone's values? And I think that actually doesn't that optimistic view doesn't take into account the degree to which Twitter's interface and scoring system really actively changes the kind of input that's measured. So, two things to think about. First, the interface tends to capture short term reactions. So, if I give a tweet that's like really long burn and really thoughtful, and someone thinks about it, and 2 weeks later they're into it, they're not going to press like. The way that Twitter works, those tweets are gone and lost. Twitter captures short term reactions, immediate reactions, because that's when the button is there. Second, I think this is more important. Twitter's aggregation mechanism flattens out intensity and complexity of response. So here's what I mean. Twitter doesn't let you register, oh my god, that's so deep. It doesn't register anything beyond a mere liking. So that binariness, I think, imposes a really interesting filter on the kind of information that Twitter's metrics capture. So I'm drawing here from a really interesting essay from Matt Stroll, who's a philosopher of art, called Against Rotten Tomatoes. And what Matt Stroll argued was that in Rotten Tomatoes didn't look at whether a critic was really moved. All it looks at is an aggregate of whether the critic's opinion is above average or below average. And so what Stroll points out is a lot of great art, incredible movies are real like they have some people that love them passionately and some people that hate them. And that divided opinion shows up as a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. And all that richness of, oh my God, this is the most amazing, life-changing thing ever is lost, right? So an interesting thing about Rotten Tomatoes is a movie that really incredibly moves half the people shows up as mediocre. On the other hand, a movie that everybody likes just a little bit, they think it's pretty good, shows up as 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, right? So what's going on is the Rotten Tomatoes, by placing a binary filter on information capture, loses all this information, instead emphasizes an aggregation of mere total likability, right? Um, it it emphasizes basically the mass number of vague preference. So my worry is that Twitter, and then a lot of other things that affect our intellectual life, like citation rates, ref scores, right? All this other stuff, that a lot of it is passing through the same filter. The claim here isn't that our values are in principle unquantifiable. It's that the methods that we currently have in large scale institutions with the technologies we have that generate quick scores tend to lose a lot of information and flatten the value landscape and standardize it. Right? It focuses all of us onto the same kind of thing. So let me give you just a quick example. So I think we should be tailoring our values to ourselves and psychologies. So think about a moment of entering into a new kind of activity. So I used to be really sedentary and I started exercising. And when I exercised, I discovered that there are lots of different kinds of exercise that were good in different ways, that serve different values. So long distance trail running is really zen like. Trail running is really intense and complicated, but really textured. Ultra marathoning is grueling and intense. Deadlifting is super, super intense. And then rock climbing is like very puzzle solvingly and delicately and balanced. And you get to choose when you experience all these things what exactly the value of exercise is for you, which valuation fits your personality. But if you're value captured by Fitbit, then you don't go through this process, right? In that case, you just let the watch set what your value should be. Now, I'm not saying that if you put on a Fitbit, you're instantly value captured. I'm saying that if you enter the process and let your motivations be set by Fitbit without further reflection, then your values have been captured. So, my worry my big picture worry is that our world is full of intellectual metrics, everything from student GPA to citation rates to ref factors. And insofar as they motivate us, they reduce the variety and plurality of motives for intellectual life. And they bring our motives into line with something that's easy to measure on a public scale. And that's what I'm worried about. Thank you very much.